Well, thank you, Brad, for the presentation, and thanks to everybody for being here today. My name is Carlos Romero. I'm a postdoctoral fellow working at the University of Lethbridge and also at the Ag Canada Research Center. My main area of expertise is soil fertility. I worked a lot with nitrogen fertilization in wheat, winter wheat specifically in Montana, and also looking at things like soil health and carbon sequestration as affected by different cropping systems. However, within the last 2 years, I've been working with basically manure and compost. So a little bit different from my background. I'm here today to share some key findings of a project funded by Ag Canada and the University of Lethbridge that was developed by Dr. Tim McAllister and Dr. Erasmus O'Kine. This project has a huge animal science component and was developed with the idea that biochar, if added to feedlot cattle diets, could be a feasible strategy to reduce enteric methane emissions. We know that cows produce methane, which is a byproduct of ruminal fermentation, and methane not only represents a waste of energy for the animal, but also a hazard to the environment because methane is a potent greenhouse gas. To put you in perspective, it has 25 times the global warming potential of CO2. So if we figure out a way to reduce methane emissions, it could be a win-win strategy for both the animal, feedlot producers, and also the environment. But before I start talking about this project specifically, I would like to give a brief background about biochar. What's biochar? Well, biochar is basically a form of black carbon that is similar to charcoal, but it differs from it because it has been developed or produced to be used as a soil amendment. We're pyrolyzing organic residues such as manure, wood chips, or straw. That means under oxygen limited conditions and high temperatures that could go from between 350 to 700 Celsius to obtain a product that is really stable. And that's because during this pyrolysis process, these organic residues are condensed and polymerized into more aromatic cyclic extractors that are really carbon rich. And because it's really complex, we are transforming a material that, for example, manure straw would last in the field for a couple of months or even like a couple of seasons, to something like biochar that will last in the environment for 100 to 1,000 years. So you may hear about biochar. There is a lot in the news or blogs dedicated to agronomic production. And it's basically marketed as a climate change savior, something that we can use to augment significantly this capacity of soils to trap CO2, unlock carbon, and mitigate global warming. From a soil fertility perspective, I think it's interesting to emphasize that biochar has a porous structure with a large surface area, so that makes this material really reactive with its surrounding environment. And that means that biochar can be both a source or a sink of nutrients that will define the fertility of a soil, either ammonia, nitrate, or phosphate. Because if it will affect the nutrient dynamics, it can directly affect things like crop yields. And of course, the susceptibility of soils to produce greenhouse gases such as CO2, nitrous oxide, and methane. As I said before, because biochar is really carbon rich, it can also be used to sequester soil carbon. So overall, this looks all good. However, in reality, biochar is used by very few people, and it's used on the larger scale setting is basically non-existent. Why? Well, because biochar is really expensive. We're talking about from $1,500 to $2,000 per metric ton. Sometimes it's really hard to find biochar, and also it's hard to handle. Biochar is a really dust powdery material that will basically impose a significant challenge to apply it when applied to the field. So now, like, people is shifting to alternatives to increase efficiency of biochar applications by lowering the amount that we need of biochar in the system. And that's where this idea of feeding cows with a little bit of biochar in their diets comes into place. Although, as I said before, this is a project that has a huge animal science component. From an agronomics or fertility perspective, it's important to understand also what's going to happen with the produced manure once released to the environment. So with Dr. Sean Howe, a soil scientist at the Ag Canada Research Center, we're looking to answer the question, what is the agronomic value of biochar manure and biochar compost? We're targeting 3 components: the fresh manure, compost, and finally, once that compost is applied to the field. We're targeting things like nutrient retention and, of course, greenhouse gas emissions from an environmental perspective. Okay, the manure trial, this is the first component of these 3 sets of studies, took place at the feedlot of Ag Canada Research Center. It lasts approximately 200 days. This study obviously, or this trial happened obviously at the same time that animal scientists were monitoring things like enteric methane emissions, dry matter intake, digestibility, etc. We use 4 biochar diets, either 0, 0.5, 1%, or 2% of diet dry matter as biochar. We have 4 diets or 4 treatments, and these were replicated 4 times, so we end up with 16 pens. And I basically went on a monthly basis to collect fresh manure during the morning. And this happened between January and July of 2019. I should emphasize that the biochar that was being offered to the cows was derived from a pine wood feedstock and had a neutral pH and a carbon to nitrogen ratio of around 450. And this is because biochar, this type of biochar, had a really high concentration of carbon, almost 80%, versus a really low concentration of carbon of less than 0.5%. To put you in perspective, organic matter, soil organic matter, has a CN ratio between 10 and 12, and a mature crop residue from either wheat or corn will fluctuate between 80 to 120 of CN ratio. So 450 is a really, really high CN ratio, and that means that this material is going to be hard to be decomposed by soil microorganisms. Okay, now we start talking about results of this manure trial, and here I present 2 graphs, 2 box plots. There are basically the total carbon concentration of the manure here in the y-axis as a function of the diet or the biochar concentration moving from 0 up to 2% here in the x-axis. A similar setting I'm using here to present the carbon to nitrogen ratio. If we start looking at the extreme treatments, the 0 versus the 2, for both metrics, the total carbon and the carbon to nitrogen ratio, we observe that adding biochar up to 2% of dry matter significantly increase the amount of carbon that you will have in the manure, but also the carbon to nitrogen relationship. So not only you have more carbon, the material is more stable, excuse me. When we start looking at trends or how things progress between the 0 and the 2% diet, we observe that in the case of the total carbon, things increase in a linear way. However, if we look at the CN ratio, we observe first a decrease followed by the subsequent increase on the CN ratio, what we call a quadratic trend. So this is suggesting that although, yes, biochar affect both or increase both the total C and the CN ratio of the manure, the nutrient output in terms of carbon and nitrogen in the manure from the animal is not affected the same way when we're talking about or looking at things like carbon versus nitrogen. Moving forward, now that we knew that biochar was affecting the carbon and nitrogen content of the manure, we were looking to answer the question, is there any effect of biochar, or I should say, is there any effect of the animal on the biochar structure once basically the biochar has been exposed to ruminant digestion? So for that, we did a before and after comparison. We put biochar particles under a scanning electron microscope of the raw biochar, basically the one that we pull out of the bag. And then the after one is the one that I handpicked with forceps from the dung, wash it, and then put it on the microscope. If we look at the two pictures to the left, we can see that the structure of the biochar was rough and porous and had sharp edges, which are basically indicating that this biochar was derived from wood materials. If we look at the two pictures to the right, we can see that the structure was very similar from the original one, from the before. We observed similar pore size, sharp edges. So overall, this microscopy images are telling us that biochar structure, the physical structure, is unaltered after passage through the gastrointestinal tract of cattle. And this could be because biochar is recalcitrant, so it won't be really appealing for microbes in the rumen, or because biochar particles are so small that it will go quickly, or will go quickly inside the rumen. We're talking about time scales that could vary from 15 hours to less than a day. So the exposure time of biochar within the animal is not enough to affect a considerable change on its structure. So this finding here is really important to understand how stable biochar is and how that can basically affect properties of the fresh manure and the resulting composting process. Moving forward, we knew that biochar was increasing carbon, and this was an expected result. But we were curious about what will the effect of biochar in terms of the carbon composition of the manure. Carbon is an element that is present in nature, attached to other carbons and other elements, such as hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. And the way that these elements are arranged in a space, its structure, will basically define how susceptible they are to microbial decomposition. So knowing the carbon chemistry or the chemodiversity of our material is really important to predict the stability of these amendments once applied to the soil. So I would like to first put attention to this picture to the right. Here I include a biochar manure, the one at 2% dry matter, and a regular manure, the one without any type of biochar. These three graphs are basically a snapshot of the chemical composition or spectra of the different type of carbon that we have in these mixtures. First, if we looked or pay attention to the two spectras, A and B, biochar without and with, manure without and with biochar, we can see overall that the shape of the spectra was pretty similar between the treatments, between the materials. So this is telling us that biochar did not really alter the overall composition of the manure. However, if we start looking more in detail, particularly focusing our attention to the aromatic portion of this spectra, that is the one that is hard to decompose, and taking into consideration the chemistry of the pure biochar that has a huge amount of aromatics, we can observe and say that this aromatic character was translocated to the biochar manure And that's basically because we have these undigested particles in the mixture. So although it did not change the overall composition, the presence of biochar in manure increased its aromaticity. So again, in conjunction with CN ratio, this is telling us that this type of manure is going to be more stable once applied to the soil. The lessons that we learned from this first study is that biochar, when added to the diet, will increase the manure carbon content and its carbon to nitrogen ratio. Higher manure carbon is probably explained by the presence of these undigested biochar particles. And because of this increased aromaticity, biochar manure will have a higher soil carbon sequestration potential than regular manure once applied to the soil. Okay, what happened next? We basically plow the pens, collect all the material, fresh manure, old manure, bedding, and we perform a composting trial that lasts 90 days. This happened also in 2019 at the Lethbridge Research Center, and we only used the extreme treatments, the 0 and the 2% biochar diets. In this case, we analyzed two types of manure handling, either compost or stockpile. By compost, I mean that you're turning your windrows regularly to improve aerobic decomposition. And by stockpile, I'm referring to the construction of windrows with no further turning. So basically, you're leaving your manure to decompose over time, just as it is. The experimental design, we have 4 treatments that arise from the combination of these 2 biochar diets and these 2 stockpile treatments and compost treatments. We replicate these treatments 4 times, so we end up with 16 windrows. And here I'm showing you the compost side of the experiment. To study this process, we basically sample the compost at the initial or at the beginning of the trial, after 3 turning events, and at the end of the trial. So we basically collect subsamples of the compost and analyze it for its chemical properties. We also monitor greenhouse gases on a weekly basis, that is CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. And for that, we install chambers on the top of the piles. And we also measure temperature fluctuations on a daily basis. As you can see here, we install probe temperatures in the middle of the piles. Okay, some results of this study. Here I'm showing you the effects of manure type and handling method on temperature. I'm showing temperature basically here on the y-axis as a function of the duration of the trial. If you know here, I partition the graph by depth. We analyze the 30 centimeters, 60 centimeters, and 90 centimeters from top to bottom in these windrows, and is obviously partitioned by compost or stockpile. I should emphasize that the red dots represent regular manure, the yellow ones or orange ones represent biochar manure. The blue triangles are basically the ambient temperature, and in the case of the compost treatments, the stars are basically depicting the turning events. If you start looking at the graph to the right, the stockpile, you can see that the temperature fluctuations between manure types across steps were similar. So really the presence or absence of biochar in the manure did not modify the temperature of the composting process. A similar pattern was observed for the bottom temperatures of the compost at 60 and 90 centimeters. Again, the presence of absence of biochar did not really affect the temperature of the compost windrows. However, if you pay attention to the graph indicating temperatures at the 30 centimeter depth, you can see that somewhat consistently the biochar manure had lower temperatures than the regular manure counterpart. So If we think about temperature as a proxy for microbial activity, so the hotter the piles, the more active the microbes are, we could infer that probably the presence of biochar that we know that is more stable or is a stable form of carbon could have probably lowered the microbial metabolism in these piles, lowering the decomposition process. So this is something really important to not only the maturity of the final compost product, but also the greenhouse gases that will be emitted from the pile. Overall, we observed that the temperatures of the biochar manure piles were 6 degrees Celsius lower than those of the regular manure. Moving forward, as I said before in the materials and methods, we also analyze the final properties of the compost. Here I'm presenting you a lot of variables. There is a lot of data. I organized, for the sake of simplicity, these bar graphs in two. To the left, we have compost treatments. To the right, we have stockpile. By M, I'm referring to manure, and by VM, I'm referring to biochar manure. C means compost, and basically S, stockpile. We start looking at the graph on the top. I should emphasize that although total carbon concentrations between treatments were similar, the CN ratio of the compost or stockpile that had biochar manure was significantly higher than those of the regular one. And this is probably related to that high CN ratio of the biochar and its high X stability. So you're obtaining a really, you're obtaining a product that has a really, really high concentration of carbon, but it will be nitrogen deprived. When looking at the graph at the bottom, in terms of plant available nutrients, either allicin P here, the concentration in the y-axis, or ammonium, nitrogen as a function of the treatment, you can see that the stockpiles, the presence or absence of biochar did not really affect the concentration of nutrients. However, in the case of the compost, adding biochar reduced the concentration of allicin P and ammonium. And this is probably because biochar absorbed a significant portion of this nutrient to its pore structure. Other variables that we study, pH, water extractable organic matter, no changes. However, for the case of nitrate, biochar manure, in the case of compost, had higher concentrations than the regular manure. So I guess that here, I know there is a lot of information, but I guess the take-home message is that the effect of biochar will depend on the property of the material or the compost that is being studied. And so there is not a definite answer. It can go in different directions, and will also be dependent on the type of biochar that you're using. The time that you're measuring this, it's not going to be the same if you're measuring at the beginning, in the middle, or the final phase of the composting trial, and also the rate or amount of biochar that is present in the mixtures. Moving forward, the final component that we looked in this study was basically the budgets of greenhouse gases being emitted from the piles. We measure nitrous oxide, CO2, and methane fluxes. The way that these bar graphs are organized is basically the same as the final properties. To the left, we have the compost. To the right, we have the stockpile. In the case of nitrous oxide, things were pretty similar, no statistical differences between treatments. The same happened for the stockpile in case of CO2 emissions or methane emissions. However, when looking at the compost, the presence of biochar significantly reduced the emissions of CO2 and methane from the piles. In the case of CO2, this could be explained by those decreases in temperatures that I showed before. Lower microbial activity, lower respiration, lower CO2 emissions. Overall, we learned from this study that under these conditions, the manure type or effects were largely limited to compost. not to the stockpiles. And this is probably because in the composting process we're fostering microbial degradation or microbial activity and degradation of the organic matter by frequently turning the piles. Biochar affects the surface composting temperature, will increase the CN ratio of the compost, but it will diminish available ammonium and also P. Overall, because of this reduction in temperatures, biochar will reduce the total CO2 fluxes from the piles and at the same time reduce the methane fluxes. And this is really important from an environmental perspective, particularly as we're moving forward to a carbon market economy here in Western Canada. All right, closing the loop. We basically apply the obtained amendments to the field to see their effects on crop yields, particularly barley silage and under irrigated conditions. This trial was conducted last year and we apply the amendments, but we also utilize things like inorganic fertilizer, pure biochar, and of course, an unamended control. We monitor the process by measuring nitrate and also P on a monthly basis in the topsoil, greenhouse gases on a weekly basis. You can see here the chambers that were installed in the plots. And of course, at the end, we harvest the silage. I mean, the barley. Here at the bottom, we have a nice depiction of the main activities that happened during this trial: the application of amendments, seeding of the crop, harvest, and in between the soil sampling and the gas sampling as well. Due to the COVID pandemic restrictions, things proceed very slow, so we only have at this moment yield data to share with you today. This yield is expressed on a fresh yield basis, and here on the y-axis is expressed on a kilograms per hectare. And here on the x-axis we have all the treatments. I know there is a lot of abbreviations here, so I wrote them here to the right, and also the rates that were employed or were applied to the field, excuse me, for the sake of clarity. And if we start looking at this graph, basically to the left we have the controls, the unamended one, soils that only receive CAN 27 and triple superphosphate, and soils that only receive pure biochar. To the right in these brown columns we have different variations of regular manure and biochar manure, either composted or stockpile. Overall, we can see that there are different responses. However, I should highlight here that if you're looking to apply biochar to the field, you should do it in conjunction with manure or compost. Do not apply biochar or pure biochar to the field. As you can see here, we observe a significantly real reduction. And this is because, again, as I said before, biochar is really recalcitrant, has a high CN ratio. So if you're applying a material that is providing a lot of carbon to the soil, the microbes will need to go after some nitrogen that is in the soil to be able to process these surplus of energy, what is called nitrogen immobilization. So basically this will diminish the availability of nitrate or ammonia for your crop, basically hampering crop yields. On top of that, from an economical perspective, as I said before, biochar is still expensive and it's really difficult to handle in the field. So I think the way to go here is to use biochar, but in conjunction with organic wastes, such as manure or compost. Okay, this is all for today. I would like to take the opportunity to thank Canada, the University of Lethbridge and Cool Planet. I would like to acknowledge my supervisor, Erasmus O'Kine, which is the principal investigator of this project, and my co-supervisors, Drs. Sinhao, Tim McAllister, and Paul Hassendonk, and as well all the co-workers that helped me in this project. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and with that, I will be happy to take any questions. Thank you.